Then you look at drug testing. And let's say, and one of the first drugs they test when this comes on after DSM-3 is Xanax, alprazolam for anxiety disorder. You all heard about Xanax? Well, you didn't at the time it came to market, though. So Xanax was actually, we had the old benzodiazepines, Valium, et cetera, and they were known to be addictive in the 70s, and there was warnings about don't use these drugs too long. And then Xanax comes along, and it also gets approved. It becomes the first drug approved for a newly identified disorder in DSM-3, panic disorder, okay? So you look at the studies of panic disorder. And they were very proud. This was, even though it was funded by Upjohn, it was really, academic psychiatry said, we're going to take control of this study. Okay, it was an 8-week study. We're going to either have people with panic attacks, half are going to go on drug, half are going to go on, I guess, just placebo. And then after 8 weeks, because we know these drugs shouldn't be taken long-term, we're going to withdraw patients, okay? So we know we're going to have a withdrawal end, and we're going to be able to show that we can withdraw people safely. So, 8 weeks. It's an 8-week study. What data do they report? The 4-week data. You know why they report or they highlight the 4-week data? Because after 4 weeks, there is a great reduction in panic attacks after 4 weeks. The drug looks really effective. But that's not the end of that's not even the end of the acute period. By the end of the acute period, it was no difference between the two. Okay? Now they withdraw people. And what did they find in the withdrawal time? Things went to hell for the drug-exposed patients. There was, I forget the numbers, but there was a significant percentage who couldn't come off. The withdrawal effects are so bad. So you see in that group, a group that is now addicted to the drugs. The people who tried to come off, they had an explosion of panic symptoms, such that by the end of the study, they were suffering something like, well, they were worse than they would when they entered the study, and 4 to 5 times as many panic attacks as the placebo group. So now what do you, the population, make of that study? Should you use Xanax? Bad idea, right? You get addicted to it, and when you come off, you're worse than the beginning. Did they publicize the results at the end of the withdrawal? It's in the data, but you really have to dig to the data. It's not in the abstract. They actually report in the abstract there's really no difference, but it's just not true. You can look, and in this book I chart out the difference in panic attacks. Why do they do that? Why don't they report that? Why isn't that in the abstract? Because you can't sell Xanax if that's in the abstract. That's an example of how now, under the influence, what the stories we were told about drugs stops being truthful. I'll give you 2 more quick examples. If you look when the SSRIs come up into market, you heard from Irving yesterday about how really they're not much more effective than placebo. It's very minimal. That shows up like crazy in the data right away. In fact, in Prozac, you actually see data that shows Prozac is not as effective as the old drug on many studies, as imipramine. You see the FDA in its review saying, well, Prozac's really not very good here. Maybe it's a little better than placebo, but it's not as good as imipramine. Did that review get into the scientific literature by doctors who now are working for drug companies? No. Instead, we heard that the Prozac is at least as effective as imipramine and safer. So that's an example of a perversion of what is reported. You can see this time and time again with antidepressants, with the new antipsychotics. You can see that trials are biased by design, the results are spun, that sort of thing. But those are industry-funded trials. Surely the NIMH-funded trials, funded by the government, when these people are not working under the, with the drug companies, maybe they'll be more honest. Pharmaceutical influence is not there. Well, I will tell you, I think the distortion of science in the NIMH-funded trials, which had a longer look and were seen as meant to guide care, are more perverted than the industry-funded trials. And I'll give you 3 quick examples. ADHD. By 1992, it was acknowledged, now we've been medicating kids with stimulants for at least 12 years by now, a little bit more, that there was no good evidence that stimulants provided a benefit on any domain of functioning over the long term. So you can see, this is even admitted in a psychiatric textbook. They says we have no evidence that there's lower delinquency rates, better educational achievement, better educational employment when we give these kids these drugs. So what do? They mount a study called the MTA study, the multi-site multimodal trial. And when they mount this study, they say, this is the first good clinical trial of any pediatric disorder in psychiatry. And this is the study that's going to tell us whether we're helping kids grow up and thrive. This is it, okay? And then you go to when they announce the study, they say, at this point, we have no evidence that stimulants provide any improvement in any domain of functioning over the long term. Okay, now in my opinion, the study was biased by design, but I won't get into this. Here's how the study goes. Kids are randomized into one of four groups. Drug alone as prescribed by experts in ADHD. Drug alone as prescribed by people in the community, ordinary clinical care. And I think there was drug plus behavioral therapy and behavioral therapy alone, okay? And what they announced is after 14 months, the kids treated by drugs prescribed by the experts, they have a greater reduction in their ADHD symptoms, and there's a hint they're doing better on reading too. Big announcement. We finally have evidence that these drugs provide a long-term benefit. And if you go on the web today and you're a parent searching for this and you pick out a guide by the American Academy of Child Psychiatry, I think it is, it will say, how do we know these drugs work long time? They'll cite this study, the 14-month results. Okay, this is what's guiding our understanding. What they don't cite is the fact that that study continued. And what happened now, at the end of 14 months, it's just naturalistic. If you've been on drug, you can go off. If you haven't been on drug, you can go on. But they're just going to chart people, and they're going to look at medication. And by the end of 3 years, the researchers announced something startling. If you really dig into it, it's not in the abstract. What do they announce? That by the end of 3 years, medication usage is a marker not of benefit, but of deterioration, even on the core ADHD symptoms. And now what really is happening is the non-medicated kids are continuing to get better, whereas the medicated kids are sort of stagnating, even on their ADHD symptoms. But a marker of deterioration. Was that in the abstract? No. Did you have to read the paper really clearly to get that? Yes, you did. Has that been announced to the people? Does any parent, when they go on, are they told about the 3-year results? They're not. How about the 6-year results? 6-year results are these. Greater ADHD symptoms, greater delinquency rates, a greater sort of functional impairment, all in the medicated kids. As one researcher, who's a psychologist who was involved, said this. He only said it in the UK. He won't say it here because he's afraid of his funding. He said this, William Pelham. We had thought that the medicated kids would do better. That turned out not to be the case. We found no benefit on any domain of functioning. We found that it would help their kids behave better over the short term, but not in the long term. And that should be made very clear to parents. Now that's the psychologist. By the way, there's some data showing that the psychiatrists on that who really ran the study did not even really want to present this data. They were unhappy with it, and they certainly were not unhappy with him for saying this. So, yeah, just one second. They also, by the way, were 6 times more, I think it was, I'm going to get this wrong, but there was a much greater risk that they were anxious and depressed, the medicated kids as well.
What was the one that used to say that kids that went on Ritalin, that made them shorter?
Oh, that showed up too.
Why is that?
Because I don't know exactly, but it's an appetite suppressant. Ritalin is an appetite suppressant, but they found people being shorter too. And at least in this study, they did not find catch-up growth over time. So, and this goes to the point. They had a long-term study. There's nothing of benefit on any domain. You just have the risks that are left, and the risks include converting to bipolar, etc. But is that communicated to the public? It's not. Is it in the psychiatric textbooks? It's not. Is it on the websites by the APA, the NIMH? It's not. That's the problem we have. That's what I mean psychiatry under the influence. It doesn't tell us the real story. 2 more quick stories. One of the things we then look at, and then I'll go, no, why don't I stay on the studies? So they build a market for, as they go through the antidepressant market, initially they go with adults, right? By the early 1990s, the companies, though, were saying, the adult market's getting saturated, we need to sell these. What's an untapped market? It's the kids. Okay, so they made a campaign now to start selling antidepressants to kids. Now, one of the problems they had at this moment was that it was understood at this point that kids really didn't get depression. They got moody, but they didn't get clinical depression. So now you see some American psychiatrists who are going to be highly rewarded for this saying like, we used to think kids didn't get clinical depression, but now we know they really do. Okay, now that sets them up as a market. Then there's someone named Martin Keller from Brown University. He says, and I forget which company. I think it might be SmithKline Beecham. I'm not quite sure, but he says, listen, I'm going to test your drug in children. I'm going to show it's effective, and this is going to be the greatest database ever shown about antidepressants effective in kids. He does this. Someone does it for Prozac's drug, fluoxetine. And what do they really find when they do these studies? They just generally don't work in kids. In other words, they're not even effective over the short term. And what eventually comes out is that of the first 7 companies that looked for labeling, pediatric labeling, 6 were denied by the FDA because the studies weren't showing efficacy. There had been 15 studies submitted to the FDA and 12 were negative at that time. But what did you see if you looked at the research literature? These were effective. The very studies that were being shown negative into the FDA were being being presented to the public as effective. Think about the betrayal of that. Then we get a black box warning, okay? And because there's a risk that these drugs are increasing the risk of suicide in kids, and the data seems pretty solid on this, or at least suicidal ideation, the FDA puts on this black box warning. In the UK, they basically ban all SSRIs in kids except for fluoxetine, Prozac. Now, in my opinion, the trials in Prozac were so biased by design against kids, it's ridiculous. But then we do an NIMH-funded study of Prozac in kids, in teenagers. And there's 2 things, I think. It's really effective in this one, much more than any industry-funded trials, which you have to ask why. Well, you can find that, in fact, it was unblinded, so that makes a big difference. And then they report this. There's no excess suicide risk in the drug-treated kids, okay? And this resurrects the prescribing of fluoxetine to kids. There's no excess risks. We did a careful study, and they report that there's 9 suicide attempts in the placebo arm and 9 in the drug arm. Or there are 4 arms. There's CBT alone, CBT plus drug, placebo, and drug alone. So the CBT alone is in the non-drug group. So no excess suicide risk. So I'm not the one who discovered this. There was a Swedish psychiatrist who wrote and said, you need to look at this table on the suicide reports. And if you look at this table carefully, you'll see a totally different story. Do you know in that study, in fact, 17 of 18 suicide attempts were in kids on SSRIs? Only 1 not on drug. So how do they tell us that there's no excess suicide risk? How'd they do it? Here's how they did it. You get randomized to placebo for 12 weeks, right? Then after 12 weeks, what they wanted the placebo group was to go on drug, okay? So they encouraged them to go on drug. Same with the CBT alone group, basically. They encouraged them to go on drug. Now, what happened is in the CBT alone group and the placebo group, there were 8 kids in the next 24 weeks that tried to commit suicide, made a suicide attempt. But those suicide attempts were reported as due to the CBT alone group or the placebo group. So in other words, they got chalked up back to that randomized group even though they were on drug. Now, if you read the study carefully, it's there. The data is reported. There's this table where you can figure this out. You can see. They actually do report the data. But do they discuss it? Do they summarize it that way? Is that what's in the abstract? No. Now, if you want to look at the betrayal, I know mothers following that study whose kids went on Prozac, We're told that there was a study that showed the drug was safe, and those kids committed suicide. Now, what do you think those mothers think about this? Finally, I mentioned the STAR-D study. The STAR-D study, largest antidepressant trial ever conducted. It was meant to guide long-term care. At the end of 1 year, out of 4,041 patients, only 108 had remitted, stayed well, and in the trial. That's a documented stay well rate of 3%. Is that data in the abstract? No. There's a table, but you can't figure out the table. It took a psychologist named Ed Piggott to look at the protocol and get Freedom of Information requests to finally make sense of that table. So why can't you make sense of that table? They're hiding the data, right?